Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my room. It's a little later in the day than usual. I hope the lighting is still decent for this particular video. I had a conversation with Johnny, Hugh, and Jonas yesterday, other INFJs whose channels I recommend, and there was a nice discussion among INFJ men. And one of the topics that was discussed was one that kind of stopped me in my tracks. At the time, I didn't really get the chance to chip in, perhaps because I was thinking, sometimes I'm like, I find it hard to react in the moment, but now I think that I can probably contribute something to it. It's a question I think that Hugh is concerned with in a kind of, in a systematic kind of long-term fashion. And it is the question about, how INFJs can change the world, how can they bring change in the world. And the question really revolved around that and around, what are the ways in which INFJs can, do the best impact. How can they perform this impact? What kind of shape does it take? How can they do it in such a way that it makes them happy? And these various things. And I have to say, based on my experience, I would say that it is not impossible for INFJs to have, large-scale impact on society. We have historical figures to prove it. But I'm not sure that these historical figures are, if you like, are average cases. By definition, if they are historical figures, if they are figures that had an impact on world history, they were not average. And let us keep in mind that for all our INFJ-ness, we are, pretty much all of us around the average. Now we can try to transcend ourselves into something else, and I think that's a noble goal and something to strive for. But in order to make a change, in order to contribute to lasting change in society and people, I think there's a few things that we need to be aware of. We need to have in mind. And I think the first thing is to have an idea of what we're looking for. Because changing people, first of all, is not necessarily a good idea. Allow them to create the conditions, to encourage them to change in certain ways can be good, but we sort of need to have an idea of why. Like, changing things for the sake of changing them is not necessarily a good idea, We have to have an idea of what we're trying to do. And I think it's probably an important thing for an INFJ to have in mind. And on top of having an idea of what we want to do, contributing positively to lasting change of some sort, there's also the question of being kind to ourselves as to the extent to which we can do that with our abilities, with our capacities, with our stamina, with our needs, always next to it, our need to have a lot of private space, which might contrast and compete with the need that would be required for a large-scale impact of being in the public eye a lot. Which is probably why a lot of these well-known INFJs like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela are often seen as ENFJs, because I think perhaps sometimes people wonder whether it really is possible for INFJs to be that much in the public eye. I'm not really decided on these topics, but ENFJs, INFJs, sometimes they can be quite close. So, but the problem is, if you don't really have an idea of why you want things to change, you just have this striving for contributing to positive change because you've got a strong FE, because you have a vision, or at least you have the potential for a vision to which you want to put FE at the service of this vision. You sort of have this striving, but you don't really know what you want to do with it. You're not going to do anything, and you're going to end up being frustrated. On the other hand, if you know what you want to do, but it's very ambitious to the level of society, it's the level of large scale kind of change towards a better functioning world or something. It has like a very sort of ambitious project at the basis of it. Chances are you're not going to do it either, because you're setting up for yourself a goal that is too high, and so high that whenever you're going to start trying to think about how to start implementing it, you're probably going to be like, okay, I give up already. It's too ambitious. It's too hard. I don't even know how to begin. And I think that's a genuine risk for a lot of these potential like change makers, or people who see themselves as change makers, but who are of such a constitution at their personal level that the limits of this constitution could conflict with the dimensions of the ambitions that they set up for themselves. Perhaps having like big ambitions can initially give the illusion of having like a motivating kind of impetus to do things, because you can be like the person who contributes to this massive change. Maybe that's not the best approach. Unfortunately, an alternative which would be available to some people, which is to simply like work with others towards making a larger scale change, like sharing efforts. I mean, of course, it's possible, but it's going to also conflict with this same INFJ need for independence, very strong, profound need for independence, which cannot be underestimated, as well as a need to have alone time. And not to have alone time necessarily all the time, but to have alone time when that happens to be needed. And the INFJ sometimes doesn't quite know when that will be needed, but it does end up being needed. And when you sort of need that alone time, you sort of have to go for it, and it doesn't matter if you're dealing with people you don't like, or people who are not really well known to you in the public eye, or whether you're dealing with people that are your friends that you want to work with. Alone time is alone time. So to me, these potential limitations, not knowing what you want to do, having too high ambitions for what you want to do in terms of positive change, and only being able to work with others to a certain extent, but not to the extent that you could do it constantly for years, perhaps, unless you're an exceptional person. I know that it would be very hard for me. Given these, maybe the best way for an INFJ to begin to implement this goal of creating a change in people, because the reason also why I'm making this video is because I do think that INFJs have this ideal, and a lot of INFJs derive a great sense of pleasure from both the prospect and the actuality of implementing, change in people's lives in some way. Seeing that people evolve, perhaps in positive ways that suggest that the INFJ might have had an influence on this change. I think that this is incredibly ingratiating to INFJs. Of course, it is for anyone, but it is particularly for INFJs. It's going to speak so much to their ideals. It's going to speak so much to their sense of identity. It's going to speak so much to their aspirations. But the change does not have to be super large scale. It does not have to be continuous, and it needs to be specific. It needs to be determinate. Now, determinate doesn't mean that you need to have like a super well-defined goal. You just need to have an idea of where you want to go. So, for instance, if I can give my example, the goal that I've set for myself, because I am also predicated upon like this desire to contribute to positive change, to create a kind of change in people's lives. When I say change, I don't mean like changing people. I mean like bringing in a perspective that might make people have ideas or thoughts or make decisions that maybe they wouldn't have made if they hadn't heard what I said. These might be micro decisions, these might be micro thoughts, but that for me is already enough. So as you can see, I'm already doing it. I make videos. So that's not a very large scale thing, because I sort of need to make sure that like the way I make videos remains true to my authentic kind of like ideals, which are very important. So for me, if I were to start trying to aim for like a lower common denominator by sort of dimming down the contents of my videos, I feel like I'm no longer really authentic to myself, and then that would be a bad sort of decision, because maybe in the short term that's what I would do, and I might derive some very short-term gratification for that, but quickly that would be sort of cancelled by the frustration I would feel like not being true to myself. And so this reasonably small scale impact I try to have by making videos, but not just by making videos, by talking to people. Every time I talk to people, what I try to do is not talk to them about MBTI. I very rarely ever do that because I don't want to be a preacher, you know. But if people come to me, they have a natural tendency to ask me questions that are of a slightly more philosophical nature or psychological nature, slightly more abstract, because I just have this vibe, you know. I'm known to be this guy who spends all the time thinking about these things. And so whenever they do ask me that, what I try to do is to listen to them, try to really pay attention to what it is that they enjoy in these particular topics, and then focus what I'm saying on this particular angle that I know they like, and suggest potential readings, potential things to think about, potential perspectives to have. Sometimes it's going to be about personality typing, sometimes it's going to be about philosophy, a more stoic approach to life, maybe a more existentialist approach to life. And I try to also set an example by making very, very few compromises in the way I am myself. You know, if people see that you're preaching something, for example, but you're not really consistent, which is all the more likely to happen if you preach, because preaching is extreme, which therefore means that if the content of what you say is extreme, you're more likely not to respect it, even inadvertently, by just being yourself. Whereas if what you talk about is not as extreme, you're much more likely to be consistent in your behavior vis-a-vis what you're talking about. And so I try to do that, and I think that I'm more or less consistent in doing that. And so really my purpose is get people to think, be thought-provoking, provoke thoughts. I don't care about people agreeing. I don't care about people being mad or being whatever. I don't even necessarily care if it goes over their heads. I think what annoys me doesn't annoy me, but whenever I'm disappointed in my actions and my content is when people have understood what I was talking about, but it failed either to provide some sort of support, solace for some people to make them feel understood, or when it's sort of people say, okay, that was okay, but that's been said before, it doesn't really bring anything new. That's the only moments when sometimes I'm like, okay, so I need to work more on providing content that's a bit more thought-provoking, provides a perspective. They might not agree with it, but as long as it widens their horizons, expand the minds. And I have a lot of people, in fact, I would say a lot of people, you know, either like in writing on the forums where I publish some of my writing, and on YouTube where I speak, where I provide some spoken words. There's a lot of people, a lot of the positive feedback I get contains words like thought-provoking and expanding the mind. So that you see, it's not so much about agreeing, like, because someone could find something thought-provoking and still not agree, or mind-expanding and still not agree. But to me, that's already something. That's the locus of the change that I want to bring in people's lives. It's not on the surface, it's not very ambitious, but to make it work requires being prepared, being focused, being consistent, being insightful. And ultimately, I find it very satisfying to myself as well. So that was the little kind of insight that I wanted to bring into this question of how can a person, or more specifically an INFJ, change the world, how to go about it, how to achieve it at one's level. Let me know what are your own visions, your own goals in the comments, guys. See you soon.